All right, what is up, APUSH kids? Welcome back for our slideshow review of Period 3. I'll try to get this done as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Just as kind of a heads up, Period 3 is going to cover everything from 1754, which is the beginning of the French and Indian War, all the way through 1800 with the election of Jefferson and the first peaceful transfer of power in American history. So a lot's going to happen in those 46 years where America is going to go from a bunch of small colonies that are totally fine being part of the British Empire to a point where they're willing to declare independence, fight a war for their independence, gain their independence, establish a really, really weak government because of their fears of monarchy and tyranny, and come all the way around to creating a new system of government with the Constitution, as well as our first two presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. So there's a lot here, even though it doesn't cover that much time chronologically speaking. And this period is going to be approximately 12% of the exam. So we looked at 5% with period 1, 10% with period 2, and now here we are approximately 12% with period 3. So I'm no math teacher, but by the time we finish this video, you'll have been over a quarter, so about 27% of the way through the exam. So these first three periods are really important. It could be a quarter of your score. Make sure you are up and ready and good to go. Now, some big ideas. At the very beginning of the period, we're going to see a new colonial policy, the ending of what we talked about in the last video of salutary neglect. We're going to see the reactions escalating by the colonists up to the point of declaring independence. And we're going to see what I call new nation, new problems. Or now that we got a country, now what? And those problems are going to be big and going to require an evolving response by the colonists. So let's get started. As I talked about, the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War, is really caused by the British encroachment and really the colonists' encroachment west. We talked about a lot in this class about the problems on the frontier. The French and Indian War is just another example of problems on the frontier. Really, the land in question is the Ohio River Valley, a land that the British colonists and the British Empire says is theirs, a land that the French says no is ours, and the natives say actually it's ours and it's been ours for a long time. But that does not stop the two great European powers of the time from fighting another in their long series of wars, really all over the globe. So it's called the French and Indian War because the vast majority of the Native American tribes are going to side with the French for pretty logical reasons. The French, as I talked about in the Period 2 video, have a much more peaceful coexisting relationship with the Native Americans, whereas the British colonists and settlers do not, as the colonists for the British are in much larger numbers, and they are not just there to, for example, trade beavers, but they are there to spread out, to farm, to establish communities, and to pretty much do everything that the Native Americans do not want them to do. So the vast majority of the Native Americans, except the Iroquois tribe, who was a very, very powerful tribe in the area, the Ohio River Valley, who actually split over the war, are going to side with the French. Now, after 7 years, go figure, Great Britain wins the war, and the consequences for winning that war are actually quite vast. Consequence 1, France is removed from North America, which gives Great Britain, at the time, pretty much free reign to spread out as far west as they want to. It's going to be a whole big chunk of time before the Spanish and their empire is going to get in the way westward. By that time, actually, it's going to be Mexico independently. So consequence 1, France is gone. So the colonists get what they want, which is, in their minds, the ability to spread out westward. Consequence 2, Great Britain is broke. They've been fighting wars upon wars upon wars, largely with the French, but other nations as well, over the course of the previous 50 years, and their war debt is quite large. Consequence 3, the British realized that the more the colonies grow in North America, the more powerful and spread out and large they're going to be. And there might be some trouble with that. So the British start really looking at their own colonial policy towards the colonists in North America and thinking to themselves, maybe we need an adjustment. Uh, Not to mention, as soon as the French are gone, the colonists begin flooding into the newly acquired land in the Ohio River Valley, which is going to cause a ton of immediate conflict with the Native Americans. So, two real short term reactions, really three, to the ending of the war. The first is Pontiac's Rebellion, super important. In Pontiac's Rebellion, we see the colonists spreading out into the Ohio River Valley in great numbers, and we see Pontiac, who is a chief of a Native American tribe, not being happy about this spreading out. Um, Pontiac and his followers, his Native American tribe, launch a very coordinated assault on a series of British forts in the Ohio River Valley, and they're very successful actually. Before being pushed back, they cause a lot of damage to the British presence in the Ohio River Valley, and that's going to lead directly to the Proclamation Line. Now, the Proclamation Line is passed in 1763, the same year the war ends. And it's going to say that the colonists are going to be restricted to settling east, so closer to the Atlantic Ocean, closer to Great Britain, east of the Appalachian Mountains, and they are not allowed to spread past those mountains. Now, that's going to rub the colonists wrong for two reasons. Reason one, they really haven't been restricted on where they could or could not settle up to this point, so this is a new thing. It's a new restriction, it's a new control, and they're not going to like that. Reaction. The second reason there's a problem with this is the colonists really look at the French Indian War as a war that they fought. Yes, the British were there to help. Yes, the British Navy and this and that. But the colonists really think that they bared the brunt of the responsibility for the war, and therefore they should be the ones who get to enjoy the benefits. And in their mind, the benefit is the ability to spread westward, specifically to the Ohio River Valley. So by not being allowed to spread out from Daddy England, they're not going to find that very enjoyable. Now, really, the Proclamation Line is largely ignored by the colonists. They're going to kind of spread out anyway because it's a very difficult law to enforce. But still, it sets this precedent that England's going to start beginning to control the colonists more strictly. 1 year later, the Sugar Act is also passed by Parliament in England. And it's a means of raising money on imports to the colonies by taxing them. And it's really just to help pay for the war. Now, this is going to make the colonists real mad because they have not really been taxed by Great Britain up to this point. But if we took a step back and looked at it, the colonists aren't paying any taxes to Great Britain, but they are enjoying Great British benefits in terms of protection from the Royal Navy, a place to sell their goods, a place to buy goods from. The colonists are really enjoying the benefits of being British without having to pay the financial cost of that rebellion. So the British passed the Sugar Act. And the colonists are not happy, and what comes out of these two new acts, the Proclamation Line and the Sugar Act, is a long series of domino events that are going to eventually lead to the Revolutionary War. Excellent. So in the period from 1763, when the war ends, to 1776, we see a series of events that are going to be, like I said, an escalating response from both sides. Like I said, Britain is in large debt from this war and other wars. They're going to end that salutary neglect policy and take a much more active, aggressive role in what the colonists are doing, who they're paying, who they're trading with, what's going on in day-to-day life in the colonies, and it's going to rub a lot of colonists the wrong way. But it's important that we understand that at the beginning of this time period, as the French and Indian War ends, the vast majority of colonists are going to go from being totally happy being British to being okay with fighting a war for their own independence. So some of the acts you guys should know, not necessarily to know the specifics, just to know the escalating nature of them. After the Sugar Act gets repealed because the colonists are so angry, Great Britain passes the Stamp Act, which is a tax. Requiring a tax on all printed goods, so newspapers and wills and legal documents. Any of these documents need to have this stamp to show that the tax has been paid. The colonists get real mad, as you see down here. They're resisting of this new control, and they create the Stamp Act Congress, which writes petitions to the king asking for this tax to get taken away, and it does get taken away, and they're successful there. Parliament's going to take a step up, pass the Declaratory Act, which says yes, colonists will get rid of the Stamp Act now. But don't forget that this act should remind you that we have the right to pass any tax whenever we want because we feel like it, because we said so, because we're Parliament. The acts are going to escalate from there with the Townshend Acts, finally the Quartering Acts, which forces the citizens, specifically in Massachusetts, to pay for the quartering or the housing and feeding of the British soldiers. It's going to eventually result in the Boston Massacre, in which a couple of colonists are killed by the British troops who are stationed there in Boston. Of course, this gets propagandized by Paul Revere, as you guys will remember, with the famous engraving, which shows, oh, this terrible defenseless crowd of colonists being massacred by the British, when in reality, the British action is just a reaction to being antagonized by the crowd. Eventually, the Intolerable Acts, or called the Coercive Acts in Great Britain, which shuts down Boston's ability to have colonial assemblies. It shuts down the port of Boston. So Britain is taking a step up with every one of their new acts, and the colonists' reaction is also taking a step up. They think they're being taxed without being represented, which goes against English common law. They don't think it's fair. They're going to start with the Stamp Act Congress, which writes petitions to the king, which are successful. To get the Stamp Act repealed, they're going to eventually start forming committees of correspondence, so using the written word, which is an important continuity in American history, to communicate from Boston to Pennsylvania to New York, to keep all of the colonists informed about what's happening in different places as England asserts a tighter control. This is a big deal as it starts to show some semblance of colonial unity amongst people from different places in the colonists. Eventually, we're going to see the Sons and Daughters of Liberty formed to resist taxation, to protest, to carry out things, the Sons of Liberty wise, like the Boston Tea Party, in which they're protesting the Tea Act and throwing tons and tons of tea into the Boston Harbor. That's the one that actually results in the Intolerable Acts as a reaction. The First Continental Congress is formed. We start seeing boycotts, non-importation agreements on British goods, which are very successful economically. And eventually we see shots fired at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. That really, at that point, there's really no backing down and the war will come. Now, it's important we understand the idealistic reasons, the root cause for colonists to be resistant to these new taxes. There's three reasons that are important to note. The first is English common law. The colonists see themselves at this time as proud English citizens, and therefore they think they are protected by. It just basically says the important thing here is that you can't tax people without their consent, and people have a right to be represented by who they choose. So the colonists argue, like, yeah, we don't mind paying taxes. We pay taxes here all the time, but we pay taxes to our colonial assemblies, people who we pick, who make laws that represent us. We have no representation in Parliament, and therefore Parliament does not have the right to tax us. It's a compelling argument, but the British will argue back that no, colonists, you have what we consider virtual, not realistic, not actual, but virtual representation in the Parliament, because you are represented by the fact that your vendors and your salesmen and your merchants and all these people that you deal with have representation in Congress, in Parliament, excuse me. The second reason for resistance are the natural rights that come off of the Enlightenment, which we discussed in our previous video, which argue for separation of powers, that not one branch should have all the control over what happens, and that people should have a say in who their government is, and when their government doesn't do the job, then their government the people have the right to overthrow that government. And the third is another thing that had taken place in Great Britain is the Glorious Revolution, in which in England they created a more constitutional monarchy as opposed to a pure monarchy, which said that the king doesn't have the power to just levy or charge taxes whenever he feels like it. And the colonist argument here is that Parliament is acting like the king had acted pre-Glorious Revolution. So these are the logic behind their arguments. They're pretty compelling arguments as well, but the British side of things is also compelling. Eventually, 1776 is a large turning point year in all of American history. We're going to see the publishing of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which argued with, what do you know, common sense, that America had the right to break away for scientific reasons, for religious reasons, for geographic reasons, for political reasons, for economic reasons. And he wrote it in very, very common everyday language so that this pamphlet, that really what it was, would be accessible by Americans of all levels. He's urging the colonists to unite, to come together, and to become independent from Great Britain. Also in 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, which lists at great depth and length the grievances or the complaints against King George III, the colonists' justification for why they're breaking away, which is important because it adds credibility to their cause internationally. It's fully inspired by Enlightenment ideas, by common sense, by natural rights, by consent of the governed, and by this newfound belief that when a government is not serving their purpose, the people have a right and a duty to overthrow that government and replace it. Of course, with the Declaration of Independence, we see the onset of the Revolutionary War, which the colonists will, in the end, win, or you could argue not win, just fight long enough for Great Britain to go away. They win for a couple reasons. One, it's a home field advantage. They're fighting the war on their turf in the colonists solely. They have strong leadership in George Washington, who is able to keep the cause together despite a lot of tough odds when times get tough financially and militarily. And they have really strong beliefs, right? They're fighting for their independence. That's a higher calling, a higher duty than simply the British soldiers who are fighting because King George said they had to keep the colonists as part of the empire. But arguably the most important reason they win is foreign aid from France. France jumps to the colonists' aid, but waits until after the Battle of Saratoga to do so, because France wanted to make sure they weren't going to be backing a losing cause. So once the colonists show that maybe they do have a pretty strong chance to hold out and win the war, France jumps in. And with French support, you have some military support, but more importantly, you have a navy that can keep the British occupied, which takes away the real big British advantage, which is having an established navy. So the Treaty of Paris 1783 is what's going to give us the conditions of the end of the war, which grants the United States full independence from England. But, as I said, new nation, new problems. There's a huge fear in America of centralized power at this time because they looked at what had just taken place with British policy and said, we can't have a government that strong. It's not a good idea. It's going to create problems. So they're going to create what's called the Articles of Confederation in response. Now, under the Articles, if we have weak central government, no power to tax, no clear, powerful, enforceable executive branch, and almost all of the powers are going to be left to the states. Each state's going to be looked at as sovereign, as free, as independent. In a sense, this really does create 13 separate little countries. There's no unity at all. There's a ton of problems with how to change the articles. You can't create a new tax. You can't create a new amendment. You can't change the articles at all without unanimous consent, which is incredibly possible to do. And in this case, each state under the articles in their weak government, each state has the same amount of votes. So Virginia and New York, the two big states, population-wise, and even Pennsylvania, another big state, are going to have the exact same political power as a Rhode Island, for example, who has nobody. So it's important to understand that it's not really fair in terms of representation. And even if it was fair representation-wise, there's nothing really that can be done because it's a very weak central government. One success under the Articles is the Northwest Land Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinances of 1787. Under it, dealing with the Northwest Territory, of course, which is right here in black on the map. We established a couple really important things that don't really seem that important until we understand why they matter. We established that in this new territory, and then all new territories going forward, when we have new land, we will admit these new territories into our union as states, but when they come in as states, they will be full, equal members with the other states. So the U.S. won't be spreading westward and having colonies, they're going to be spreading westward and having full, equal states. So once any territory had 60,000 people, it could apply with a state constitution and so forth to be a state. Also in this territory, we see the banning of slavery. So these 5 states that come out of this Northwest Territory, which are Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, all those new states are going to have no slavery. Of course, we're going to see some tensions emerging in this time period, largely on the frontier. The 2 great examples are the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania, which are going to have a ton of conflict with Native Americans, and also Shays' Rebellion. Now, Shays' Rebellion is going to be that turning point that demonstrates for public opinion that we're we don't have a strong enough government to even uphold sanity and stability in our own country. Maybe it's time we re-examine what we have going on. However, under this time period, it's really important that we understand that the states are creating their own constitutions. We see the real birth of American democracy not under the Articles or even the Constitution, but under the state constitutions that come before this. Uh, at the outset of the Revolutionary War, the states are urged to create their own constitutions, where the states have the right to define their citizens' rights, who are the citizens in your state, and with citizenship, who gets to vote, who gets to own property, who gets to do this, who gets to do that. Um, in more conservative states, we're going to see the creation of bicameral legislatures, for example, which is going to come up a little bit, where each legislative body, each lawmaking body has two houses, an upper house and a lower house, and strong governors. The strong governor's office that has the power to enforce those laws that are passed by the state legislatures. In the more conservative states, we're going to see property requirements for voting. You got to own property. If you own property, you can be a vote. Some more conservative states where we see these qualifications in their state constitutions are Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. In our more liberal states, our more freedom-loving states, we see state governments that more resemble what happens with the Articles. So all men can vote. The government is still quite weak. So people have more rights. States like New Jersey and New Hampshire are considered liberal states. And we're going to really see the marrying of these two things in the Constitution. Now, as I stated earlier, it's Shays' Rebellion, but it's also just general weakness, economic trouble, state-to-state conflict that's impossible to resolve between the two sides that's going to create the need for a new system of government. Now, with this new system of government, we see the Constitutional Convention, the drafting of the Constitution, which is really driven by the work of James Madison, and supported by three other characters that are worth noting. George Washington, who oversees the Constitutional Convention, Alexander Hamilton, who plays a supporting role in his study and support for the cause of what strong government looks like, and John Jay. Those four, and of course others, but those four really do a great amount of work in supporting the creation of the Constitution. Now, the Constitution does a good job of marrying people's desires for both a strong government and a limited government with really two things. The first thing is federalism, and the second is separation of powers. Now, federalism is the division of power between federal governments and state governments. So states have the right to regulate X, Y, and Z in their states as long as they don't violate federal law. So it still gives a ton of authority so that state governments still feel that they matter. State assemblies, state legislatures, state governors. This is something that holds true today, that states have incredible authority to do what they want within their state. So that gives those people that are worried about a really strong, oppressive federal government, it gives them a little bit of relief and understanding their states can still largely run however they want, as long as they're not going to violate overarching federal law. And the second issue that is used to alleviate fears of a strong government is the separation of powers. The Constitution does a really good job of delineating what the executive branch can do, what the legislative branch can do, what role the judicial branch will play, so that people can be not as worried about a strong, oppressive, Britain-like federal government. Now, this Constitution would not have been created without a couple of really important compromises. The first is called the Great or Connecticut Compromise, which is really authored by Roger Sherman. Yes, if you're guessing, he's from Connecticut, hence the name. In this case, we're going to marry two plans. The first plan is the Virginia plan. The second is the New Jersey plan. And we can get into the specifics if you'd like, but the big takeaway is that our legislature, our legislative branch, our lawmaking, taxing, really at the time the most important branch, is going to have two houses. In the upper house, or the Senate, each state's going to get 2 votes. So if you're a big state, 2 votes. If you're a small state, 2 votes. If you're a medium state, 2 votes. That's going to make the people from the smaller states feel that they still have a voice in this government. The lower house of the legislature, or the House of Representatives, that house will be based on population. So the more people you have, the more votes you have in the House of Representatives. And that makes the big states feel that the fact that they have more people is at least accounted for in the creation of this lower house. And you can't pass any law without both houses, the upper house, the Senate, and the lower house, the House of Representatives, agreeing, which really alleviates fears of the big states having too much power or the small states having too much power, like under the Articles. So that's the Great Compromise. The 3/5 Compromise is a little different. This alleviates the Southern concern regarding slavery. The 3/5 Compromise says that when we're determining how many votes you get in that House of Representatives established here, the Southern states want their slaves to count as people, of course, because it gives them more votes in the House of Representatives. The Northern states think that is ridiculous, and they settle at 3/5. So every 5 slaves will count as 3 people for both representation in the House and also taxation. A lot of the early taxes are based on population in states. So the South going to pay a little more taxes for their slaves, but also they get them counted in their representation. Excuse me. But it's really important to understand that both of these compromises, both of them combined, settle this issue of representation. How many votes is each state going to get? Now, once the Constitution is done, 2 factions emerge: the Federalists, who favor ratification of the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who think that the Constitution has gone too far, that there is too much power in the government, it is not okay, and they don't like this whatsoever. The Federalist Papers are very important. They're written anonymously to be published in New York, a very important state needed to get support for the Constitution. And they're written to advocate, to push for the ratification of the Constitution. The Constitution was finally ratified when the Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights that protect individual freedoms, that restrict the power of the federal government. That then the Anti-Federalists get on board, and the Constitution is ratified. Now, this just lays out the fact that some of the problems under the Articles are then resolved under the Constitution. Under the Articles, there's no power for the federal government to tax. Under the Constitution, Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes. Under the Articles, there's no power of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce or foreign commerce. Under the Constitution, that's given. Under the Articles, there's no executive branch. Under the Constitution, there's a president. It's going to serve for 4-year terms. Under the Articles, there's no judicial branch. There's no way to settle disputes legally. Under the Constitution, we have a U.S. Supreme Court, and then later there will be a series of courts under it, thanks to the Judiciary Act of 1789, and so on and so forth. Now, our first president is, of course, George Washington, who was elected unanimously with John Adams as his vice president. He surrounds himself with the first presidential cabinet, or appointed advisors that are very close to the president. They're going to oversee departments. The cabinet has been growing ever since. His first cabinet has 4 people. The Secretary of State, the guy in charge of our relations with other countries, is going to be Thomas Jefferson. The Secretary of the Treasury, the guy in charge of our finances, is going to be Alexander Hamilton. The Secretary of War is Henry Knox. And the Attorney General, or America's top lawyer, in charge of the legal issues, is going to be Edmund Randolph. A couple important things under his presidency. One of the first very important actions is the Judiciary Act of 1789, which establishes federal or national court system. So it establishes the whole court system that leads up to the Supreme Court, so the Supreme Court doesn't have to worry themselves with petty things that are happening in states. The Supreme Court can be there to settle big-time disputes. And it's also what creates the office of the Attorney General to oversee the legal system of the country. Under his presidency is the Whiskey Rebellion, which is a rebellion against a new tax. It's very similar to Shays' Rebellion under the Articles. The only difference here is in this case, the federal government is strong enough to put this rebellion down. Washington and Hamilton both are going to lead the U.S. Army out to make sure this rebellion is put to a stop. This worries people who are worried about federal government getting too involved, because they say, look, here's this federal government that's not even letting the people protest. But it is going to show that the Constitution is an enforceable system of government, that it has some teeth, so to speak, and that people can't just go around rebelling whenever they feel like it. Also, under his presidency, we have the French Revolution, in which the U.S. decides to stay neutral, despite both sides asking for their support, much to the chagrin of the Thomas Jefferson of the world. And we see 2 important treaties. The first is the Jay Treaty, which doesn't solve much. However, it does give us a favored trade status with Great Britain, but it does not stop these things it's supposed to stop, such as the impressment of U.S. sailors into the British Army, the seizing of U.S. goods in trade, or British presence in the Northwest. So that doesn't solve that, but it shows the first example of the U.S. using diplomacy or negotiation with other countries to settle their problems. And the second is the Pinckney Treaty of 1795, which gives the U.S. access to the port of New Orleans and therefore the usage of the Mississippi River. And that's a treaty done with Spain. So both these are important for this precedent of solving our problems diplomatically. He also gives a very famous farewell address, which we'll talk about in a moment. But also under his presidency, we have a very important Hamilton's financial plan. Now, Hamilton is in charge, of course, of finances of the U.S. as the Secretary of the Treasury. He looks around at the country at this job and says, well, we got $75 million in debt. We owe a lot of money to other countries. We have a national currency that's absolutely worthless because it's backed by nothing. And we have no foreign credit. No country is going to loan us money because we haven't paid any money back yet, so why would anybody loan us more money? His debt plan, is to have the federal government assume or to take over all of the national and state debts. Now, this is going to piss off a state like Virginia, who has no debt, but it's going to be very beneficial for the northern states, and then there's going to be these complaints of Hamilton favoring the northern industrial states, which is going to kind of stick with him until he dies in a couple years. So he creates this report on public credit that points out the problems with a lack of credit, and with his pointing out of these problems, he's going to solve the financial issues for the U.S. with a couple things. The first thing is a bank. We're going to create a national bank. It's going to manage money. It's going to manage currency. It's going to manage the debt. It's going to collect the taxes and keep the taxes and make sure that we have credit as a country. And he argues that we can have a national debt because of the elastic clause. This issue that says, well, the federal government can stretch the necessary and proper or elastic clause. It can stretch when it's doing things that are necessary for the success of the country. His argument is that a bank is necessary. Washington agrees, and the bank gets created. We're going to make money as a country two ways. One way through tariffs, so charging a tax on all imports that come into the United States. That'll do two things. Thing one, it will raise money for the government. And thing two, it'll make it more profitable to manufacture things in the United States. Therefore, the U.S. can start industrializing. And his last piece here is his Hamilton's report on manufacturers, in which he points out that the most successful economies have to be self-sustaining and have to produce their own goods, and therefore we should be a much more industrial manufacturing type country with protective tariffs that keep that industry safe. Now, all of this is going to piss off Thomas Jefferson, and with him the Democratic Republicans, leading to our first two political parties. And here they are. The first two political parties are the Federalists, many of those same Federalists from the ratification of the Constitution that believe in a strong federal government with an executive branch who is strong and active. They believe in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. So using the elastic, necessary, and proper clause to stretch the government when needed. They believe in you can do anything, governmentally speaking, as long as the Constitution doesn't say that you can't do it. They believe in a more commerce, trade, and manufacturing-based economy, and they're largely backed by the merchants, the trade, and the urban manufacturing elite of the Northeast, New England. They're more pro-Britain in their style. They believe in having a bank, they believe in having a tariff, and they are very pro-order, pro-stability. The Democratic Republicans on the other side are going to be people like Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, Thomas Paine. They believe in a weaker federal government, stronger state governments. They believe in a stricter interpretation of the Constitution and following the 10th Amendment, which of course says that any power not given to the federal government in the Constitution is reserved or saved for the states. So a government that's more supportive of states' rights. They're largely backed by Southern small farmers and these rural Westerners who don't trust banks, don't trust federal governments. They're going to be pro-France because France is also going through their revolution that's based on liberty and freedom. They don't believe in banks, don't believe in tariffs because the tariffs are going to hurt them from a farming standpoint. And they're more pro-liberty, believing that the people should have the right to do whatever they want to do as long as they're not getting too crazy. Now, Washington's going to leave office, giving a very important farewell address that I told you I'd talk about, and as first president, setting some important precedents that we should note. The first piece of the farewell address is he points out, hey, I'm leaving after 2 terms. I suggest the rest of you guys do the same. And he asks America a couple things. He says, whenever you have a treaty or an agreement with other countries, like, follow those treaties, but avoid any foreign alliances. He says, Europe has their problems. We don't need to get involved. So don't sign any alliances with other countries. Now, that avoiding alliances piece is going to be followed all the way through until after World War II with the creation of the United Nations and the creation of NATO. Up to that point, we don't have any peacetime alliances with other countries. He said, don't form political parties, don't start party politics, that we just fight over things because of the other guys in their party. And of course, that gets followed for about 6 minutes. He warned America to avoid sectionalism and to put their country first. Of course, sectionalism becomes a real big issue in the 1850s, leading to the Civil War, so that gets followed for about 60 years. And he encouraged Americans to continue to follow religion, to follow morals, and to follow this idea that we're a more educated people than anywhere else in the world, and to continue that pursuit of the education and collection of knowledge. The precedents that he set that are largely followed for a long time by the following presidents. The first is having 2 terms. Serve 2 terms and then get out. The second precedent is being called Mr. President. It's a much more informal term than many wanted. John Adams, for example, wanted to be called His Excellency, but this precedent from George Washington that says, we're just pretty casual, call me Mr. President, we'll call it a day, holds true up to this day. Third precedent is the creation of a cabinet, very important, of people that are going to oversee these departments in the executive branch. Fourth precedent is neutrality, that we shouldn't get in foreign problems. The fifth is cultivating a special relationship with Great Britain. We still today in 2018 look at Great Britain as our closest ally, and that really begins with the Jay Treaty, and is followed through all through Washington's presidency and up to today. And the final precedent is the creation of, or the usage of, a farewell address to tell America, hey, this is what I learned from, being your president, and this is what I want to see our country do going forward. Following him is John Adams. Under him, a couple important things. The first is the XYZ affair, in which we get disrespected by the French because they won't let us negotiate anything unless we pay them. It causes a ton of conflict with the French, which leads to the quasi-war, in which we have like a semi-war, a naval war with France that lasts for a couple years. That eventually goes away. But more importantly, under him is the Alien and Sedition Acts. They're passed in 1798, and it says that the government, run by Federalists, can deport or put in jail any foreign citizen that the government says is a threat. It's a real violation of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in general. But the worry is all these people are coming from France, from the revolution, with radical ideas, and these people are joining the Democratic Republican Party, so therefore we should make it harder to criticize the government so we don't end up like France in their crazy bloody revolution. It increased the residency requirement to vote, so people had to be in the United States for longer before they got to be a citizen and vote. Again, an anti-immigrant sentiment. And it made criticizing the government prohibited. It's illegal to criticize the government. Again, violating the First Amendment to the freedom of speech and to the press. And it really is this desperate ploy by the Federalists to stay in control despite this large influx of immigration from Europe, who's largely going to be siding with Democratic Republicans. The reaction to this Alien Sedition Act is really important in the creation of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Now, these are going to be written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they're going to argue that states have the right and the authority to nullify or cancel or veto or ignore any federal law that they see as unconstitutional. If the federal government passes a law, states don't think it's right or constitutional, then they can ignore it or cancel it. Now, this question of who has the power to ultimately decide if laws are constitutional or not and if states have to follow them is going to actually pervade American politics all the way up to the Civil War, which finally settles in. It says, no, sorry, states, you don't get to do whatever you want. But it's a very important precedent of the questioning of federal authority because of the Alien Sedition Acts. Now, in 1800, we have the election of Thomas Jefferson over John Adams in a 53 to 47% electoral vote. As you can see, there's a pretty clear sectional divide for who's voting for who. But we see here super important precedent in that the Federalists give way. They give power to the Democratic Republicans in the executive branch, and they do so peacefully. It's the first time in world history that really power changes hands from party to party, group to group, without any conflict or bloodshed. That wraps up period 3. A couple important legacies from an impact standpoint. We see some following revolutions in France, Haiti, and elsewhere in Latin America that are inspired by the American Revolution. We see some in society calling for greater equality to live up to the ideals of the Declaration. Two good examples are Abigail Adams and Pennsylvania emancipating their slaves. However, the framers of the Constitution have postponed and ignored the issue of slavery system, and with it, no consequence. Period 3, if you got any important questions, jot them down and we can get to them when we cover this in class. But I hope that was useful, and I will see you guys soon. Thanks.